So thanks everyone for tuning in again for another Twitch stream about public transportation. And this week's topic is going to be about, if you want to, about kind of abstractly how to deal with a changing world, or how to deal, or how to kind of climb up, maybe climb up the tech tree is going to be a thing. Um, but much more concrete, or maybe about understanding why um, certain trends that may be negative exist. And if you want to learn something from the past, how to make sure that you're learning something useful rather than assuming that the wages of 60 or 70 years ago are still applicable today. So it's kind of in that note, and specifically it's about the issue of bus frequency, which is very vexing to cities with bus-based public transportation systems. So I kept telling people that this is gonna involve me being a fantasy geek, and I'm gonna apologize in advance that the fantasy that I'm gonna reference is not gonna be very obscure. That it's not gonna be some kind of series with mid catalog readers who you not catalog readers, mid catalog writers that you only hear about through Tumblr. It's gonna be Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire. And here's the thing. So A Song of Ice and Fire became massively popular, kind of promising to be more realistic and grittier, to the point that killing lovable main characters became a trope. And there has been um, a bunch of criticism of this. Some uh, of the some of the show, but also some of just the books. And I'm going to find. So this is, I think, the first that I saw that wasn't someone. Okay, so this is from Lyman Stone, who is generally known to urbanist Twitter. I'm not gonna actually click these. Just put Lyman Stone Westeros is poorly designed. He's talking about the demography. He's a demographer by training. So Lyman Stone is someone who is generally well known to urbanist Twitter for writing about issues of migration and demographics. He's also generally um, unpopular on urbanist Twitter, which is very left wing because he's very religiously conservative. But I mean, demography is demography. Um, so this is a good. These are a good, very nitpicky posts, and the other thing that I'm going to reference is a blog called A Coup by a professor of Roman military history named Brett Devereaux. Um, so let me see if I can find the best. Okay, so he has a bunch of posts, and he writes a very long series, so it's post series, um, complaining about the world building and about the military realism, especially, and both the books and the show. So the show is basically always worse than the books, but some of these things are also bad in the books as well. And the most fascinating thing when I first saw this blog, which was 2019, was that Brad, like Lyman, pointed out that actually Lord of the Rings is getting a lot of these things right. So he likewise has these posts about Lord of the Rings that I very strongly recommend. He talks about kind of the military tactics in the big um, in the big battles, and reading these posts. So, for example, the series about the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. I figured, okay, I mean, I haven't read the book since the first time I read them, and I read which was just before the movies came out, so that would be 2001, 2002. I watched the movies as they came out. I obviously know the plot points, I know some dialogue lines, but how, but it's been what 16 years, so let's rewatch. And the rewatch kind of reminded me why people liked A Song of Ice and Fire, and why people like Game of Thrones that dials a lot of these tropes of A Song of Ice and Fire up to 11. which is that um, the Lord of the Rings has a lot of corniness in it. A kind of dialogue that's very much people kind of talking about their quest to save the world, and a very, very black and white morality, and a kind of moral universe of if you just believe in yourself, then the cavalry will arrive on schedule. Things aren't going to go, things aren't going to go awry. There's never a place in Lord of the Rings where you have troops that very strongly believe in themselves, are very highly have very high morale, but the cavalry fails to arrive because of a snafu on the way, or because the lord just decided to betray the lord of the castle, and therefore the cavalry never arrives, and the castle falls, and everyone dies. So I bring this up because we can kind of see why the problems of A Song of Ice and Fire exist, kind of in reference to Lord of the Rings, and George R. R. Martin very explicitly said that he was trying to go for a grittier version of that. So all of these are understandable reasons, and maybe we can even talk about legitimate and illegitimate reasons. So a legitimate reason is, for example, the kind of traditional fantasy writing, kind of descending from fairy tales by Tolkien, is incredibly moralistic, and so trying to counter that would be interesting. So that's a legitimate reason for, and that's, I think, also why Grimdark became really popular in the 90s. Just as kind of the more recent trend of very morally affirming, let's call it, YA is likewise an understandable and legitimate reaction to Grimdark that's all about piling up the body count, piling up the rape count. But there's also an illegitimate reason for the change. So remember, Brett, who is a military historian of the Roman Empire, or of the Roman, I think it's actually more Roman Republic than Roman Empire, talks about military realism and lack thereof in A Song of Ice and Fire, compared with good military realism in Lord of the Rings. And well, Tolkien was an officer in World War One. I think he was in the artillery corps. His social circle, consisting of other upper class Brits, they were also officers in World War One. They also served. I mean, C.S. Lewis, for example. And so there was just much more grounding there, to the point that even bad military commanders, for example, Saruman, they're bad in a way that actually is part of their character, kind of to be incompetent in certain ways. Whereas, let's say, Silence and Onward, in the United States and Europe, in Western Europe, live in way more demilitarized societies. Even, let's say, people who lived through Vietnam. So this kind of realism was not a thing. So that's an illegitimate reason. There was kind of lost knowledge. I mean, the reason the knowledge is lost is good. There hasn't been a world war since, but it's still lost knowledge. So I bring this up. So I bring all of this up just to explain that whenever you see a trend today that you think is questionable, so in the fantasy example, that would be kind of lack of military realism within A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a book series that kind of screams we want to be realistic. Hence the whole George R. R. Martin line about how people said that Aragorn was a good king. Okay, what does it mean? What was his tax policy? He literally used a line. What was his tax policy? George R. R. Martin, and so when we have this trend today that we think is questionable, and maybe we see something in the past that was better, in this case, Lord of the Rings, it's useful to first of all interrogate it and say that maybe it's very romanticized, which Lord of the Rings is. I mean, that's a genuinely incredibly cheesy plot in a moral universe that is kind of preordained for the good guys to always win. And the and to kind of understand why things got this way. So in this case, it would be the Grimdark as the reaction to to conventional epic fantasy, and and also the loss of military knowledge, which again is a less legitimate reason. It's something that is not good. I mean, the reason for lack of world war is good, but it means but it's less knowledge. I mean, it makes for worse fiction when you write less militarily realistic things. Um, and so I bring this up to talk a little bit more about the issue of frequency because there's and I especially stress this kind of why the present got its way from the past mentality, and something that's especially important when you're technologically lagging. So if you're, for example, Germany, you don't care what happened 60 or 70 years ago because the trains in Germany are better than they were 60 or 70 years ago, period. So in Germany, for example, there is, as far as I know, no wall start. It doesn't mean that Germany is literally at the global frontier of everything. It's not, but it's pretty close to it. And the places that definitely are, there's not that much that they can learn from things that happened 60 years ago. But if you're very far behind, for example, North America, especially in the United States, in the United States is way worse about it than Canada. Then it's useful to understand, especially because there's this kind of tendency to think, oh, we were great 70 years ago, let's just restore that world. That world is gone. And again, understand why things got this way. And I kind of am focusing on the issue of bust frequency just because it's something that is kind of a hot topic right now. Introduced, I believe, to the discourse, I would say, to some extent by Jarrett Walker, and so that's Human Transit, and his line about frequency. So he keeps saying frequency is freedom. So the idea for him is that the most important thing is regular high frequency of service, of public transportation service, which can be to him either bus or rail. He thinks that passengers are mode agnostic or substantially mode agnostic. And this is I believe for maybe 2009, 2010, the expression frequency is freedom. It's not just him because there have been generally reformist voices within the United States that call for more service hours. This was a big thing in the Obama stimulus era. And nowadays, people keep calling for federal subsidies for bus operations so that cities can they can just run more frequent service, which is a really bad idea. I mean, more frequent service is a great idea. Federal subsidies, therefore, are just gonna not work. And so I'm kind of understanding why frequency deteriorated over the generations is something really important. And as before, and just as Lord of the Rings, on reread, I mean, the fantasy of the 1940s and 50s is kind of corny. You can likewise find things about the bus service of the let's say, 50s and 60s that isn't all that great. And again, it's useful to understand, to look at legitimate and illegitimate reasons why the change happened. So even though I keep saying that the United States is backward, I'm actually going to talk not much about the United States, much more about Canada. And barely at all about Europe, because Europe has made the tech climb that I'm talking about, which is going from bus to rail. So the Toronto situation, and I'm going to show you guys on Google Earth because I can't find the presentation. So this is by someone named Jonathan English, who is working in transportation research in Toronto, and is in the process of proposing kind of outside reforms. Kind of like as Toronto's transit matters, if you know Boston's transit matters. And so there's this presentation of it that I can't find, but I can just reconstruct it for you. So the idea is this. This is a map of Toronto, but this is a present day political map of Toronto. So this is the city limits of the city today. So Toronto, suburb, suburb, suburb. Um, but historically, this wasn't the case. This is actually something called amalgamation from the 1970s. And previously, Toronto was maybe something like this part of it, and the rest, so places like North York, places like over here it would be Etobicoke, which I'm almost certain I'm mispronouncing. Um, these were suburbs, but they were in the same regional. But they were. I think it's regional municipality or division called here. They were in the same region, and in the 1960s, this was basically the built-up extent of the urban area. So Mississauga existed, but was not the big suburb that it is now. I mean, the city limits of Toronto were again here, but the limits of the contiguous built-up area were roughly these limits, and then over the 70s, for example, they kept sprawling outward toward all these places you can see on the map here. But um, but originally this was the limit of the urban area, and what they did is even before amalgamation, they formed the Toronto Transit Commission, which nowadays is just it's just a municipal agency, but at the time it was viewed as a regional one, and what they did was they ran buses very frequently. I'm forgetting how frequently, but I think every 8 minutes maybe, to what was in the edge of the built-up area, which is the edge of of what is now the municipality of Toronto, the amalgamated municipality of Toronto. And so the buses run on a grid, which is very good for buses. These are arterials, all of these. So the arterial grid is very fast for cars and buses, not very pleasant for the pedestrian to cross, unfortunately. Um, but commerce generally clusters along the arterials or along intersection points. So so you can kind of see this here with Young especially, so the most important of these arterials, but this is more recent DoD. This is more recent transit-oriented development. Um, so the point is that it's not that it's only buses. On the contrary, there's a big subway system in Toronto. I think that actually the busiest subway station in North America is Young Bloor here and not Times Square, but maybe I'm wrong. And then it's Times Square, and then Young Bloor is a close second in North America. So again, a very busy line. This Bloor downtown is less busy. Downtown is not here. Downtown kind of ends here, but it's mostly here, which is a problem. But so in Toronto they had these buses and they were willing to spend very high frequencies on these, and this was actually without subsidies. In fact, the TTC, Jonathan just reminded me, liked the clause that required it to be operationally at break-even rate, because that way it could tell the unions, sorry, can't help you. We're not allowed to get subsidies. And extract labor concessions, but eventually that caught up with it, and it's not break even. I mean, it has high fare book recovery, I think something like 70 or 80%, but it's not break even. So it's kind of useful to understand what's going on here. How come the idea of spamming frequency on buses did work, and bear something in mind. In the 1960s, in Toronto, transit ridership is up. Public transportation ridership is up in that era, so 60s, 70s, when the system is being set up. And I believe that there was deterioration, certainly per capita, later in the 70s and then 80s and 90s. But 60s and early 70s were an era of growth, which was not the case across the border. This was not the case in the United States. In the United States, public transportation ridership cratered in the generation after World War II. Now in Toronto, this also happened earlier, but there was this recovery, sorry, in the 60s as the TTC was set up, and this did not happen in the United States. Even in, for example, New York, which until 1970 was doing okay, it had a lot of white flight, but the white flight was being replaced one-to-one by black and Hispanic migration. It's only in the 1970s that city population in New York actually fell. Between 1950 and 1970, New York had flat city population, not decreases. And yet in that era, subway ridership fell a lot, just because people bought cars. And the point is that in Toronto, the buses got there basically as soon as the subdivisions started up. As all the early suburban sprawl set up, there were buses to get people to either another bus or direct to work. And this, again, this was unusual. There is something much more common is the frequency ridership spiral, which Toronto did have later in the 70s, just that in the United States it goes back to the 50s and 60s. So what is the frequency ridership spiral? And again, it's always useful to understand when something was better in the 50s in this case, which is frequency on buses and trains in America. How come things have gotten worse? And again, this can include legitimate and illegitimate reasons. And I'm gonna mostly say that it's illegitimate reasons, but it's still important to understand why. And even then, not all of them are illegitimate. So most importantly, at the time, the frequency. So first of all, what is the frequency ridership spiral? The spiral is that whenever you cut surface in order to save money, maybe there's a recession, maybe the government doesn't want subsidized service anymore, maybe there's some kind of other shock, like let's say some people decamping for Uber, or what actually happened in the post-war era, people just get cars, and so to save money, you cut surface. And then what happens is that ridership is not purely exogenous to frequency. Because if my trip is, let's say, 15 minutes, let's say it's a 15-minute subway trip, and the train comes every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, that's actually a meaningful difference in trip times. The worst case scenario is 20 versus 25. It's not a huge difference, but it's a difference. It's noticeable. And especially when you're running on a train. So buses, their operating costs are very linear. Okay, the operating costs of a bus, about 70% of them, give or take, in North America, which is where I've seen the data in the most detail. 70% of the cost of bus operations in North America are the wages and benefits of the driver. And the second biggest effect is maintenance. And for example, fuel is nothing. I mean, in New York, I think the cost of fuel is maybe 3%. In Europe, fuel is more expensive, but also the buses are more fuel efficient, so it's basically a wash. So if you're cutting service, and you're using and you can not hire new drivers, I think, especially if you can lay off drivers, then you can save money. But there are two really important caveats, and the first is that this is not on a train. On a train, operating costs are not dominated by the driver's wage. At the end of the day, on a bus, one driver, maybe 40 passengers. On a train, one driver, 300 passengers. So different economics. And the second thing is that if you specifically cut off-peak, then you're forcing drivers into split shifts. And split shift, so when you have a double humped peak, so high frequency morning peak, high frequency afternoon peak, lower frequency midday, this forces drivers into a split shift. Let me see if I can find a good graph. Not split. And by the way, I did not pre-Google any of these things, so when I'm seeing something that says that it increases, people's stress levels, this is literally so. Um, okay. Okay. So there are bus drivers who report problems working split shifts. Um, but it's not all of them. So, um, the they do talk about individual differences. So it's again, it's not all drivers, but it's about 1/3 of drivers complain about problems from split shift. So a split shift is when instead of working, let's say in normal, let's say 6 or 8 hour shift, you have to work, let's say 4 hours in the morning and then 4 hours in the afternoon. Um, and not what I'm interested in. Um, and so note by the way that their alternative here to the split shift is not you work 6 hours on a fixed schedule. No, it's flexible shift in which you don't even know what your daily hours are. So things are not very good either. Um, so if you're doing the service cuts at in the off-peak times, so midday, then you're forcing more drivers into split shifts, but you're actually reducing efficiency. So this is how the frequency ridership spiral works on buses. There's no such spiral if it's just peak, whereas on trains there is. The point is that in order to the point is that because passengers respond to changes in frequency, um, especially when you have high fixed costs as on trains, um, and also on buses if you're cutting off peak service, if you're cutting off peak service frequency, you need to do a very big cut to save a moderate amount of money in operating subsidy. And so this is the spiral. It's not an infinite spiral. This does terminate. It just terminates in a very adverse situation. And the reason this was done is illegitimate. So the reason this was done is that it was not understood at the time in the 60s and 70s. So my standard so my standard reference on this is I'm gonna do this. It's a paper. So this is so I have this blog post about frequency ridership spirals that I heartily the words heartily and hardly sound too similar. So this is the paper that I keep referencing, Lego, Mayer, and McEnroe. This paper is, I believe, 1982. No, 1981. So this was an analysis that was done based on, let's say, 1970s data, but this was not necessarily data that would have been known at the time. So at the time, the state of knowledge was inferior to that of, I don't want to say today, inferior to that of 40 years ago. And as a result, they did not realize that they did not realize that um, cuts to frequency would also reduce ridership. At the time, in maybe the 50s, the mentality is that the only reason to run a certain frequency is to the only reason to run a certain frequency is to provide sufficient capacity. Um, so this is again, we can understand why. So at the time, frequencies started out high. When you're cutting frequency from every 3 minutes to every 5 minutes, that's not a very. I mean, you're going to lose a little bit of ridership, but it's just 2 minutes. Moreover, um, the use of public transportation at the time was much more peak commute oriented. So trips were kind of on the long side. They weren't long in the sense of being suburban long, but in New York, so New York is just an easier example for me. I know I was supposed to talk mostly about Toronto. So for example, in New York, it would be random place in Queens or the Bronx or Brooklyn connecting to the Manhattan core. And so this would easily be, let's say, a 25-minute or half-hour trip on a single train. Maybe it would change a little bit in Midtown, but the long trip would be 30 minutes. If that trip goes from, let's say, 4 to 6 minute frequency, you don't care. It's just two extra minutes on top of 30. And so early on when they were doing it, it didn't matter very much. And to the extent that ridership fell, they said, oh, okay, people are just getting cars. It's normal for people to get cars. There was the the extent to which it took time for things to get this bad is because, first of all, it took time to get to the situation of, I want to say today, but it was also the situation, let's say in the 2000s, possibly even earlier, I think maybe by the 70s, I'm not sure, that named subway lines in New York, so individual lettered lines would run every 10 minutes off peak, maybe even every 12. And second, trip lengths actually shrank. Why did they shrink? Because so when I say trip length, I mean per segment, because frequency is per segment. None of these transfers is timed. Um, so if people are riding for 25 minutes or half an hour one way on a single train, then again frequency is still important, but it's less important, especially if it's, let's say, 5, 6, maybe possibly even all the way as bad as 8 minutes. But once you introduce transfers, um, maybe because the city is getting more complex, so people are likely to be working in a place that is neither where they live nor the central business district. This is why you do these transfer-based bus grids to begin with, to provide something like everywhere-to-everywhere service. So as soon as you need transfers, um, you're ending up with a single segment trip length that is not, let's say, half an hour. It's more likely to be 15 minutes. In New York, I know the numbers. I don't remember them. They're from the National Transit Database. I believe the average per segment is 13 and a half minutes. So it'll be here. So 13 and a half minutes, if you're on a branch in New York, and most of the system is a branch just because of the interlining, the difference between running every 5 or 6 months and running every 10 is enormous. But maybe there was kind of illegitimate extrapolation, and that led to not understanding this was a thing that was going to happen. But so let me just compute this, okay? So heavy rail would be what is it? So they're doing unlinked trips. So these are single segment trips. The actual number that is reported on the subway network is not 2.6 billion. It's more like 1.7. So this is 3.8 miles. What is the average speed? I can do these, right? So it is, and the problem is it's all in miles, so I'm going to lose all of mine. Okay, so it's going to be times, so it is 0.208 hours, so 12 and a half minutes. So you understand why when trains run every 12 minutes, you're waiting for the train almost as long, in the worst case, as you are riding. No wonder off-peak ridership is so difficult to build in New York. I don't want to say it collapsed. It wasn't that high in the 50s to begin with. Ridership in the 50s was about the same as on the eve of Corona, but with a much stronger rush hour peak. Actually, even with the big increases in New York City subway ridership from 1990 to about 2010, ridership entering the Manhattan core rush hour is slightly down. And actually, it was actually higher in the 70s than today. Nobody would ever feel safe riding off peak, but peak they rode. So the point is that there was a spiral that was not understood. So this is why things got this way. Maybe the answer is, okay, just leave a frequency. But now we're getting into a legitimate reason. The reason is bus driver wages. Remember, that's 70% of the cost of a bus. You can make this better through is through cutting peak trips and not just off peak, but peak buses tend to be full, so it's hard to cut them. And ultimately, um, wages for bus drivers rise faster than for the rest of society. And it's really important to understand why, and I believe the reference to this is Robert Gordon, American Growth. This is an economics paper that turned into a book. I have not read the book, I read the paper. Um, um, this is too late. The paper was um, early 2010s, I believe. Um, okay, this is not it. This is too late. Let me see if Wikipedia has a link. So the point that the paper is making. This is or Robert Gordon 6 Headwind maybe. Yeah, this. So he argues that he argues that economic growth peaked for technological and social reasons in the early 20th century, but much more relevantly for us here, he talks about the change in the nature of work. So, for example, today there are farmers. 100 years ago, there were farmers. A lot more farmers, but it's not just a difference in the fact that today farmers are more productive and get paid better. The work conditions have improved as well. Farmers today in rich countries sit alone in their combined harvesters, um, and the combined harvesters are likely to be air conditioned, so they're not really exposed to inclement weather, which is a huge problem for farmers just waiting around in the mud. This is no longer a thing. There's no need to bend to pick anything. I mean, you might need to do physical maintenance labor for your tractor, although even that is in decline. And I know that in the United States there's this big right to fix movement complaining that the manufacturers won't let you fix your own tractor. But so these jobs are much less physically demanding than they were 100 years ago. And in general, most of the economy is like this. So, I mean, obviously not every single job. So if you're a professor today, this job is not physically demanding. And if you're a professor 100 years ago, ditto. So part of it is a change in the composition of the economy, much bigger middle class than 100 years ago. Part of it is individual jobs changed. They became safer. Uh, they became less physically arduous. Um, they became less likely to maim you. These jobs that can maim you still exist. So, for example, electricians all have hearing loss by their 50s, but it's still better than the work conditions of 70 years ago, for example. And I bring all of this up because jobs where the work conditions have not improved as much should command higher wage premiums at this point to compensate, because it's really stressful working retail, but it's not going to cause you physical health problems standing at a cashier. Now, is the stress going to cause you problems? Absolutely. It's contingent work, it's low pay, and all of these do contribute to poor health. Um, but that also existed for working class jobs until for manufacturing jobs too, or for what we today maybe think of as good public sector unionized jobs. I mean, that existed for them too until very recently. And the point is that for these jobs, it often still is a thing. So a bus is not a car. Okay, a car is small, a bus is big. The resonances within the bus really hit the front and back end. So if you sit at the back of a bus, you get bounced around a lot more. To the point that if you kind of want a quiet ride, it's one of the places you kind of don't want to sit in. You don't want to sit in the back. You don't want to sit on above the wheels. above the wheels either. If you're like a kid and you like the exhilarating ride because you don't get to ride the bus very often, then maybe you like these places, but normally you don't. The bus driver sits in front. The bus driver gets every bump in the road gets transmitted right straight into the spine of the bus driver. The amount of back pain that the bus drivers get is immense. Um, so to compensate, the wages have risen faster than in the overall economy. This is why the DTC can no longer spam bus frequency. It's because wages rose to the point that um, that it became too expensive. And remember, bus driver wages, because the work conditions are not getting better, have risen faster than the wages in the general economy, i.e., faster than the ability of the general public to pay for a bus ticket. And so that's the first problem. And again, this is a legitimate thing, and this is an economic change that needs to be resolved through better work conditions. Um, and uh, and if anything, the frequency ridership spiral makes these worse because again, it's something that mostly happens off peak. So now you're having less predictable timetables, whereas what you want for bus drivers is more predictable timetables. You want them to know that there's a, let's say, 6-hour shift that they work. They know in advance what their hours are. They know in advance what depot they report to. One of the problems, so bus depots, there's never going to be a bus depot at the end of every route. So there's pull-out time. So for efficiency, you want to minimize that. Um, but at the same time, you want to make sure that bus drivers know what depot they report to, so that because the bus depots are not usually in very central parts of the city, so it's hard to commute to them. Rail yards, same thing. I mean, some cities have a rail yard at the end of every stop. Not every stop, sorry, at the end, at one end of every line. Paris is one of them. Some don't, like New York or Berlin. But even then, it's really important to make sure that you have high off-peak frequency just as an efficiency matter. But really, what matters is to not have the midday dip. So you want the frequency to look single humped. So nothing or almost nothing at nighttime, then daytime service, then step down for the evening, then nighttime. And you don't want it to be double humped. So double hump means morning peak, afternoon peak. Because again, double humped is really stressful on the drivers. So you can improve work conditions, but only up to a point. This is still a physically demanding job. It's so bad that you can even see high obesity rates. I'm not sure about bus drivers, but I know that American truck drivers have very high obesity rates, and the issue, and trucks are the same as buses. The bumps in the road get transmitted straight to the driver's spine. It's really poor work conditions. And the obesity is part of it. It's a job that's incredibly physically stressful. You're never, I mean, you're unlikely to have time to have time or mental energy to cook. You're very likely to be in a very regimented situation, so you're very likely to be eating fast food, often in large quantities, which is something that you probably also share with menial workers, but you're not quite a menial worker. You're not actually burning 4,000 calories a day the way that a steel worker does. You're burning 2,000, so that's the result. I mean, it's not obesity as moral failure or anything. It's obesity as as a work hazard. And the, um, so again, this is a legitimate reason why it's hard to run this bus frequency. And there's even a worse thing. So again, going back to Toronto's case specifically, so we can see that this is so we can't see directly on a map that this was roughly the urban limit in the early 60s, but we can see that it isn't now. It goes to some extent north for Restaurant Hill. There's the green belt, so beyond the green belt, development is more of a patchwork. So places like Aurora, Newmarket, all the way up to Barrie. But east-west, it's very contiguous. There's a short gap here, but it doesn't really matter. It goes all the way to Oshawa in the east, and then in the west, Mississauga is basically contiguous with Toronto at this point, ditto Brampton, and it can keep going not just to Mississauga, but to Oakville, to the point of the merger with Hamilton, almost. And this means that, um, and this means that if you want to try to re to try to redo the 1960s and 70s, the bus service, which again, the TTC only goes to the city limits of Toronto. Again, it was a regional agency, but the region only extended as far as here. They never actually did such a thing at larger scale. They're doing something like that with Metrolink, but the problem with doing a Metrolink with buses is that the distances keep growing. And at short scale, for a few kilometers, yeah, sure, the bus can run an arterial, and so can the cars. But at longer distance, cars are not going to run on these arterials. Cars are going to run on the freeways. Thank you very much. And freeways suck for buses. They don't have enough exits. Car traffic on the expressway is so fast that you can kind of see there's not actual street-facing development here. Why would there be? It's noisy. You can have development near the exits. Did I, at the beginning of this video, say Etobicoke was in the east of Toronto? No, this is Scarborough. Etobicoke, Etobicoke is west. Sorry. I'm really sorry. Anyway, so you can kind of say that, yeah, development kind of wants to be near the freeway exits, near the interchanges, but it doesn't want to be at them. This is land intensive. You want to be a little bit away, and this is really bad for buses. It's going to be a long walk crossing very unwalkable streets. It's very different from the arterial, where the development. Okay, so again, this is not even so. This is maybe an example of more TOD, but it's not even young. It's just you definitely do see more density to some extent facing the trains. Where they exist. Again, this is a freeway, it's not an RTO, but it's a short freeway, partly canceled. So it was built when the drivers insisted they get the freeway and not just a subway extension. So it's not as crowded as, let's say, the 401 here. Um, and so it's much easier for buses to run on arterials than on freeways, but at a longer scale, cars run on freeways. Suddenly the bus time premium grows from a factor of, let's say, 2 or 3 to a factor of more than that, 3, 4, 5. And even bus lanes are not going to help you. And remember, you're paying the driver for all this time. So longer range, you basically have to go to trains. And also, as the wages increase, you have to crowded, so you might have standees and it's really impossible to stand on a bus. And then you're turning it into a streetcar, and then the streetcar provides the same capacity every 6 minutes on instead of the bus every three. It's still, you're still okay, because you're still only paying half as many workers, and it's a reliable 6 minutes. And 4 versus 6, especially when it's a reliable 6 versus an unreliable 4, that's not a difference that passengers care about. So you want to trade up the duct rate. You want to use less labor, which means go from buses to trains. And frequency is important, but you need to understand the limitations. You need to understand that you can't just spam bus frequency and hope to get the same results in 1960s Toronto. Wages were lower then. Let me see if measuring worth of Canadian GDP. If not, I'm just gonna use American instead. They only have the US and Britain, so let's do the United States. So let's look at 1960. This is in constant 2012 dollars, so 18, whereas in the actual 2012 it was 51, and on the even current it was 58, all in constant dollars from 9 years ago. So all of these can be bumped by the same factor for more modern. And so remember 19, or no, not 19, remember 18 from 1960? And then 1970 was a big increase to 24. And even looking at the little difference between 2019 and 2012 dollars, it's what, 65? That is, okay, about 20K a year in American GDP. Canada would have been a little bit less. And let's just, no, I don't want, let's do World Bank. So let's do US RUC. Let's do price. So 20K again in 2019 dollars. This is all in 2017, where like they renorm these every few years, but the renorming isn't perfect at long range, which is why this only goes back to 1990. The previous norming from 2011 only went back to 1970, not 1980. So you can kind of say that Russia is noticeably richer today than the United States was 60 years ago. So wages are going to be higher. China today is almost as rich as the United States was 60 years ago. So the upshot is that it's important to pay attention to changes. In this case, would be changes, first of all, in geography. So there's more sprawl to the point that at longer range, you need things that are independent of a street network, so freeways or railways, to move people around quickly. A second difference is that costs have risen, just because of bus driver wages. Third reason is that it's actually understood what the frequency ridership spiral is and how it affects specifically the off-peak more than the peak. And so bus frequency again is a worthy thing, but it's always controversial to build streetcars, and in Berlin it's very controversial to build subways because there's always a sign of why build one subway when you can build 3 streetcars, or why build one streetcar when you can build 3 buses. So you just pick the strongest of these routes. It's basically you're always winning on operating costs when you do either of these things. And then the question is whether the capital costs justify it, and that depends on local capital construction costs. So here actually we build tramways decently efficiently. I think it's like 20-ish million euros a kilometer. So and maybe in the United States it's more expensive because they have high construction cost problems. But the outcome is that to the extent possible, you want to trade up. You want to trade up um, up the value chain. How the hell are you spending $200 million per kilometer on a tramway? Is it like Eglinton, where it's partly underground, partly at grade, or is it 200 million all at grade, which is going to be insane? I mean, not even Calgary does that. And Calgary had a pretty big shit show for the West LRT, which is which is to some extent underground and elevated. But if it's actually all at grade, how the hell? I mean, not even the American. I mean, Milwaukee Max gets close to it, but not quite there. Um, so it's really important to again to trade up. And again, if you have problems with construction costs, you need to fix them because um, construction costs have this problem that they've been rising with incomes, but they aren't higher in rich countries than in poor countries today. So in our transit cost database, this is the one that I linked to. Didn't actually link to my chat. It's this one. Um, I'm forgetting whether the analysis is there, but you can grab the table. Just make sure you control for whether it's elevated or underground, because poor countries build more elevated lines than underground lines. But net of that, there's no difference between the construction costs in the richest and in countries across the entire income distribution. We have, again, we're missing some developing world things, but we have Dhaka, we have Cairo, we have Tehran, which actually one of the better ones. We have Ho Chi Minh City and Saigon, and not Saigon, that's Saigon, and Hanoi. We have so we have things. We have India, so we have things that are decently poor, and the cost range looks first world for the most part. Sometimes even worse. So it's kind of weird where construction costs rise temporarily with wealth, but not cross-sectionally. But the point is that you absolutely can keep a lid in your construction costs so that it's not going to cost 200 mil per kilometer. Um, and then when it costs something more normal, then yeah, better payback period. So you should start doing it and start replacing these buses with streetcars, knowing that wages are going to keep rising. So you need to constantly look for ways, if you're in a very rich city, which Toronto is, to find ways to replace labor with capital. Um, do you want to say 20 million? You mean dollars, right? I mean, it's not going to be 20 million kroner per kilometer, which would be insanely low, right? It's like 200 million kroner per kilometer or something. Yeah, okay, okay. Um, by the way, Dominic, do you have a link to this just so that I can look at this later? At the Lund tree car. Ooh, thanks. I'll follow up. Oh, it just opened. Yeah, and so they said it was gonna cost 776, but it cost 900. Yeah, that happened. That's the thing that happens. Um, yeah, no, that's actually on the cheap side. Yeah, so Sweden, for example, can yeah, so Sweden could, for example, do this trade more easily just because Swedish construction costs are abnormally low. Um, most Nordic ones are. Denmark is kind of the exception. Um, but and say kind of, by which I mean it's average rather than very low. And so it's easier to trade if you're Sweden than if you're Germany. Ooh, that's a really good question. Um, okay, so about articulated buses. Basically, whenever you have a bus line that's busy, you always want to go Arctic because remember, the bus driver gets paid the same no matter what kind of bus it is. Do you need to pay more for procurement of an Arctic? Yes. Do you need to pay more for maintenance? Yes. Do you need to pay more for fuel? Oh yeah. These are not most of the costs. Um, So whenever possible, unless it's, I mean, if it's a standard bus every even 10 or 15 minutes, don't convert it to an Arctic every 20. It's gonna suck. But if it's a normal bus every 4, yeah, make it an Arctic every 6. Um, Biarctics are, I know they exist, but they're much rarer. And about curb running bus lanes. Okay, so first of all, curb running bus lanes are kind of terrible. You want transit to always go into the fast lanes because then you're gonna have a little bit of physical separation between them and the car lanes, and the car lanes are just gonna respect them as the fast lanes. It's, one of the things that you can see out about our kind of legacy streetcars in Berlin is that so sometimes they have dedicated lanes, sometimes they don't. They are too slowly transitioning them to dedicated lanes. But even when they run in shared traffic, they're in the fast lanes, and this really does help with avoiding traffic. In fact, one of my calculations, when it says like you're replacing a bus every 4 minutes with a train every 6, I was assuming the bus was already Arctic. Um, because then it's 18 meters and the streetcar is going to be maybe 35 meters long. If that makes sense. Um, so I'm basically done here with talking about how bus frequency needs to run, how plans about bus frequency have to run up against very real constraints of higher wages mainly, and due to job decentralization, um, it's much more common to have multi-legged communities in which each leg is shorter, so that reinforces the importance of frequency. So it's not that frequency doesn't matter; it really does. Just it's really expensive. And the worst problem is when you say, oh, frequency is really important, so let's try to provide it, but we don't have money for a bus every 6 minutes, so let's do a bus every 15 and call it frequency. Um, sorry. Um, so I'm basically done with the main of this. I can take questions for let's say the next 10 minutes or something, and then I'm gonna close this. Oh yeah, so I know that AV buses are being tested, but at least so far they're not. They don't seem very. They don't seem like mature tech. Um, yeah, they're saying within 5 years. I mean, I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, electric buses are actually a little bit more advanced, and even they are not quite ready for prime time. They're bad when the temperature goes below freezing. The heating requirements eat the battery, eat through the battery. The cold climate agencies try not to do it. Shenzhen is not. I don't think has ever had a freeze. I think on average, let me actually start. I think on average the winter temperature in Shenzhen is 15 degrees. And Tel Aviv is likewise getting Tel Aviv had snow last in 1950. So climate data for Shenzhen, daily mean 15.4. Tel Aviv is about 30, is 15. So yeah, what works in Shenzhen does not work where there is winter. Like how do trolley buses factor into this? So size-wise, they're buses. Comfort-wise, they're buses. Now they don't have the diesel fumes, and that does help. They have permanent infrastructure, so you can just see where it's going. Oh, right. Okay, so diesel fuel heaters. Okay, so they're not electric buses. They're buses that are partly electric, partly diesel. Okay, that's not an electric bus. Okay, Tesla does not have a diesel fuel heater. Um, I mean, Elon Musk overpromises things, but the Tesla is all electric. So are BYD products. Um, so anyway, about trolley buses. Trolley buses are good for climbing hills. They don't really deal with operating costs very much, just because operationally they tend to be just buses. Um, but at the same time they uh, are so at the same so at the same so but sorry words. So at the same time, so electric buses, um, again, they work okay. It just it depends on the weather, and they're not going to work in Toronto, or in New York, or wherever. Um, so trolley buses, what about them? They're better for, let's say, these for air pollution. They're better at climbing hills. Um, they are not necessarily comfortable to ride. If anything, they accelerate and brake more abruptly. People with back pain, or with chronic fatigue find trolley buses to be like buses. Um, so trolley buses have their uses, especially if you're doing a kind of a hybrid thing called in motion charging. So you're wiring part of the route, and then you're fanning out, and then you have a couple of kilometers of fire range, on various branches. So then it's really good for air pollution, minimal expense. But that's not for everywhere. That's not when you have a grid. Um, According to this, Finch West LRT is 2.5 Canadian dollars for 11 kilometers, 16 surface stops out of 18 total. What are please tell me the other two are underground, at least, and not elevated. But even then, I mean, it's really expensive. An underground exchange street, exchange station, an underground not exchange, interchange station at Finch West, and one below grade terminal stop at oh my god. Why? Why? Vancouver used to be able to build full subways for this cost. Not anymore, but it used to. Back when it was Lincoln cover. Wait, that's not true. That's not as expensive as the North South Line. The North South Line was um so it's like 400 million per kilometer, not 200. Oh, okay. So the more recent electric buses have figured out, okay, have figured out how to operate above freezing. Okay, good. By the way, are there any other questions? Or are there questions that people ask that I neglected by accident? But anyway, the card, yes, Canadian costs are worse than Dutch costs. It's hard to be worse than Dutch costs, but never count the angles you're at. Much as the Netherlands wants to be the Britain of Europe, complete with Mark Rutte being politically more similar to Boris Johnson than you would like to admit. Um, so where would I recommend switching to trolley buses? Um, so hilly areas, there's a reason the biggest in North America, the biggest system in North America is San Francisco. I believe it's San Francisco, then Vancouver, then Seattle, so hilly places. Another really good thing is in motion charging. Now, there is a Transit Matters uh, program for this, which is called Better Bus, which is not one that I'm involved in. So I know from other campaigns like Regional Rail, people who are involved in, who are also involved in Better Bus. However, I am not involved. And this means that when I tell you what I think the strong corridors in Boston are, I may have slight errors. Um, so what I understand to be the most important corridor, um, is So bear in mind, of course, this is not a gridded city, and this is going to be really important. It's a city with like a more organic street network, so you have main lines that branch outside the city core. So on electrification of the buses, on Washington Street, which is where they used to run the L until they moved the Orange Line L from being here to the current route in the right of way of the railway. Um, you might ask if there's a demographic reason: black people, white people, black people, white people, former elevated line, black people, current railway line, white people. I don't think it was intentional, but it happened. They said that they're getting BRT instead, which is as good as rail, which isn't. The There are bus lanes over here that are called the double parking lanes. The bus lanes vanish in downtown Boston and at Dudley because there's so much traffic, so they didn't want to give away a car lane. Very, very galaxy brain MBTA, the and this is something that honestly should not just be so it's something you could do in motion charging. Honestly, wire this part maybe a little bit more, and then and then you have really heavy workhorse buses that keep going down to Mattapan here on Route 28. It's called 28, or a bus that keeps going that does most of the same route and diverts Ashmont. It's called 23. So you have a bunch of these routes, and if you just wire one trunk, you can not wire electrify all of them for lower cost. How long do I think it would take for AV buses to be feasible in the median running? I don't know. It might even be viable already. I'm not sure. I need to sit down with people who are working on this stuff. Um, I actually know a bunch of people who work on driverless cars. I can ask if people would like me to. By the way, by the way, Paula, did I answer your question about where trolley buses make sense? And likewise, Well and Perkins, have I answered your questions about AVs or other classrooms? Awesome. Does anyone else have questions? Yeah, so when you can electrify a trunk line, it's really good. So it's less valuable in very rigidly graded cities like Toronto, um, but in cities where you have a kind of a trunk and branches system, it gains value. IMC. Autonomous trains already exist. They run every day in Copenhagen. They run um, in Paris on formerly not automated lines, so it's not a new build like in Copenhagen. Um, Nuremberg is like Paris. In fact, in rich countries, um, when a new subway line is built and it's self-contained, so it's not an extension of something older and it's not an extension of the surface network, then my understanding is it's usually that newer systems are usually built driverless. How did trolley buses fare in the Soviet world? It's hard to say because there's a lot of cultural fringe involved. So, for example, the mayor of Moscow decided that the trolley buses were insufficiently modern, and in his campaign to modernize Moscow, he decided to turn it into a crusade about why there shouldn't be trolley buses, and they actually, I believe, they removed the catenary and replaced them with BEVs, and the BEVs cost something like twice as much to procure and maintain and staff than the than what they're replacing. Is the ridership biased toward trolley buses? I have no idea. The paper that I'm quoting and giving links to without citing compared buses with streetcars, I believe. By the way, don't apologize. I like trolley buses. It's just that different tools for different kinds of street networks. Toronto happens to be unusually bad for this. It's good for other things, but not trolley buses. Are there other questions? Or did I not answer your question? How valuable is it for street cars? Oh, to completely remove cars? It depends. Usually it's useful. The main reason you might not want to do it is if the street relies on a lot of car traffic for commerce, but remember that merchants constantly overestimate the share of their clientele that comes by car. Um, so transit malls definitely exist and they're really valuable. Um, but first of all, they're not obligatory. It also depends. I mean, so transit malls are a really good thing to do in city center. So if your primary layer is the streetcar network, like for example the C train in Calgary, then it makes sense. But if it's maybe more peripheral because the center of the city is actually because the center of the city is actually where the subway goes, then um, the, then it's maybe less useful because traffic is lighter. Yeah, King Street. Honestly, I mean, all of North America needs exfil. Like the standard here is that there are bus stops or streetcar stops every maybe 400, 500 meters, and then in the US and Canada, it's every 200, 250. It's just for rather weird grounds. Like I've heard people say talk about the elderly, and then you need to explain to them that they're not gonna convince me that a country with a very clear almost gerontocracy of the welfare system is not aware of the fact that old people can't necessarily climb stops very easily. Are there any other questions, by the way? Sure, no problem. So I'm gonna give this maybe 2 more minutes, and then I'm gonna cut this just because I have a little bit of lag. Not like 2 minute lag if you're gaming or something, but it's enough that I don't want to say anything and then click on stop before people have had a chance to type something in chat. Sure, no problem. Thanks for watching. Um, all right. Do I do this? Do I do paying raid if I want to raid someone? Like this? Sure. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. So if I'm trying to raid Pig, who's still gonna be sleeping on stream, I believe. I don't actually know. So there's a command for this, or is it backslash raid actually? Because I know that I tried doing this the first time that I ever streamed, and the person that I picked to raid at the end is Boom, who apparently does not accept raids. Okay. /trade. So thanks, and I will see you.